In the spring of 2020, in the hardest days of the pandemic, something strange began happening on a small fundraising page on the internet. The page had been set up to help the Navajo and Hopi, people, Native American communities in the American Southwest, who were being hit terribly by the virus. Money began arriving. Then more money. Then a flood of it. Millions of dollars from hundreds of thousands of strangers. And almost all of it was coming from one small country on the far side of the Atlantic Ocean, Ireland. The donations came with messages, and the messages, my friends, are what stopped me cold. One read, "From Ireland, 170 years later, the favor is returned." Another said simply, "You helped us in our darkest hour. Ireland remembers, with thanks." 170 years. What favor could possibly be repaid after 170 years? Sit with me a while. This is the story of one of the longest thank yous in human history. To understand it, we have to go back to the 1830s, to the American South, to a people called the Choctaw. The Choctaw had lived in what is now Mississippi for longer than memory. They were farmers and stickball players, mothers and grandfathers, a nation with its own language and its own laws. And then the United States government decided it wanted their land. The Choctaw were given a choice that was not really a choice. Leave everything and walk to a distant territory called Oklahoma, or stay and cease to exist as a people. They signed. And between 1831 and 1833, some 15,000 Choctaw men, women, and children began walking 500 miles and more through winters so cold and provisions so poor that the road itself became a graveyard. As many as 1 in 4 of them died along the way. Grandparents, infants, whole families. They called it the Trail of Tears and Death. The survivors arrived in Oklahoma with almost nothing. They set about the slow, aching work of rebuilding a nation. From the ground up, new farms, new schools, new graves for those they kept losing to hunger and disease. They were, by any measure, among the poorest people on the continent. 16 years passed. Barely 16 years. And then, in the spring of 1847, word reached the Choctaw of something happening far away, across an ocean. Most of them would never see. In a country called Ireland, the potato crop had failed, and kept failing. People were starving to death by the hundreds of thousands. They were dying in ditches with grass in their mouths. Mothers were carrying dead children on their backs. Before it ended, 1 million people would die, and 1 million more would flee the country forever. The Irish were strangers to the Choctaw. Different language, different faith, different world. The Choctaw owed them nothing, and heaven knows they had nothing to spare. On March 23, 1847, a group of Choctaw leaders and others gathered at a meeting in eastern Oklahoma. A letter was read aloud, describing the suffering of the starving poor of Ireland. And then, my friends, these people, who had buried a quarter of their nation on a forced march, who were still clawing their way back from ruin, reached into their pockets. They collected $170. I know that number sounds small. In today's money, it is several $1,000s. But the true size of the gift cannot be measured in money at all. One Choctaw newspaper editor put it this way, more than a century later. By today's standards, it might as well have been $1 million. The money was sent east and then across the ocean. And it reached the town of Middleton in County Cork, Ireland, where it helped feed the starving. Why did they do it? A Choctaw chief, many generations later, gave the simplest answer there is. We felt their pain, he said. We sensed what they were dealing with. They had walked their own trail of hunger. They recognized it in someone else. And that recognition mattered more than the ocean between them. Now here is where most stories would end. A small kindness, given quietly, fading into history. But this one did not fade, because the Irish did something remarkable. They remembered. For over 170 years, they remembered. Not officially, at first. Not with monuments. Just in the quiet way that a people passes down. the memory of a debt of the heart, in schoolrooms, in family stories, in the retelling. And then the remembering began to take shape. In 1990, Choctaw leaders were invited to Ireland to lead a famine memorial walk in County Mayo. In 1992, a group of Irish men and women traveled to America and walked the Trail of Tears themselves. 600 miles, raising money as they went. Not for themselves. For famine victims in Somalia, they raised $170,000. $1,000 for every single dollar the Choctaw had given in 1847. The gift was not being repaid. It was being multiplied and passed onward to yet another starving people that neither nation had ever met. In 2017, in that same town of Middleton, the Irish unveiled a sculpture called Kindred Spirits. 9 enormous steel eagle feathers, arranged in a circle like an empty bowl, standing against the Irish sky. A monument in the middle of Ireland to the generosity of the Choctaw Nation. In 2018, the Irish government created a scholarship so that young Choctaw students could study in Ireland, free of charge. The Irish minister explained it with one Choctaw word, Yakok. Thank you. And then came 2020, and the virus, and the news that the Navajo and Hopi people were suffering, and Ireland, an entire country. Hundreds of thousands of ordinary people stood up almost as one and said, "We know what to do with this. We have been carrying a kindness for 173 years, waiting for the chance to hand it on, millions of dollars, to Native American strangers, because of $170 given by other Native American strangers to their great-great-great-grandparents." My dear friends, here is the thing I want to leave with you tonight. The Choctaw who gave that money never saw Ireland. They never met a single person they helped. They died long before the statue, the scholarships, the walks, the millions. By every practical measure, they gave their gift into a void and got nothing back. Except that kindness, it turns out, does not work on a human timescale. It can lie dormant for a century and a half, like a seed under snow, and then bloom in a season no one predicted, for people no one could have imagined. The Choctaw fed the Irish fed Somalia, and then the Navajo and the Hopi. The circle keeps widening, and it is widening still, and somewhere down the line, it will reach people who have never heard any of these names. No kindness is ever wasted. It is only waiting. Thank you so much for spending this evening with me, my dear friends. Until next time, take care of each other. Good night.